Welcome back to Maximum Production, a Holstein Friesian New Zealand podcast about everything to do with cows. I'm Amelia, and today we are talking about nutrition and specifically transition feeding. So joining me today is Andrea Murphy, a ruminant nutritionist with Image Holdings, and she is also a member of the New Zealand Association of Ruminant Nutritionists. Andrea has dedicated her career to exploring opportunities within the agricultural industry and how nutrition can optimize production, health, reproduction, and sustainability. So thank you, Andrea, for joining me today.
Thanks, Amelia, for giving me the opportunity to have a conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. My nerd brain loves learning. So I think we can draw a lot out of you today and try and fit it into, we've been talking about this for a while, a very small little box. So
Yes.
we can't cover everything. A podcast can't go on for hours, unfortunately. But hopefully today we'll be able to give our listeners a good understanding of what transition feeding is and give them some better tips to make sure that they do process that transition in a safe and healthy way for their cows on farm.
Sounds good. It's a big topic, transition. It's a relatively small word, but a big topic.
Yes, very much so. So before we get into transition feeding and all your amazing knowledge that you have, do you want to just tell our listeners a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Okay, well, we can start with my accent. That's probably the first thing people can hear on a podcast. So this is a Kiwi accent. I am Canadian by origin, and I did my study and training to become a nutritionist. I went to the University of Guelph in Canada, where I studied ruminant nutrition and international development. And I suppose it's the international development part that is kind of by a long way around how I ended up in New Zealand. I was working on a development project in China and then had opportunity to come to New Zealand. And that was over 20 years ago. And I love it here. There's lots of ruminants for me to work with.
Yes, we do have a lot of cows and sheep and yeah. And when you and I had a conversation prior to this, you told me a little bit of information that might be actually quite interesting to some of our breeders out there. Your grandparents were master breeders in Canada, is that right? With Holsteins?
Yes, yeah. So Hosting Canada holds a place near and dear to my heart. And yeah, my grandparents were master breeders. And I grew up with a story from my Nana. She would always talk about the bull calf that she reared. He was a red factor bull, and he was ultimately sold for semen production in Japan. So that was our family's greatest claim to fame. So yeah, Holstein breeders near and dear to my heart and my heritage.
I think that's really cool. It's nice to know that Holsteins are making it all around the world and that love for, even if it's not just Holsteins, but that love for cows and that love for animals has continued on. And you've found another way to try and help benefit farmers throughout the world, which is awesome.
Absolutely. Yes, I do love cows. We've got that in common for sure.
Also, listeners, if you can hear like weird yawning sounds behind Andrea, she's got her dog sitting on the ground next to her. So
Yes, sorry about that. I love all animals, actually, including dogs.
yes. Right. So, how about we get into this transition feeding? Do you want to give our listeners a little bit of insight into what transition feeding is?
Okay. So, like I said at the beginning, transition is a small word, but a huge topic. And if we go to the fundamentals of the word transition, it's anytime you make a change, particularly in feed. And we can talk about like the obvious times of transition. There's summer crop would be a transition. There's winter crop would be considered a transition. But then there's also that transition from the close-up dry cows to the fresh cows through the calving period. And that's an even bigger change. And there's not only the change in feeds over that time, but there's also the physiological changes happening within the cow.
When should you be introducing that transition feeding? You talked about those three aspects. So, I guess, how long is it then taking you to transition into that feed?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. I'd like to just separate it out and maybe we could talk about the transition of a change in feed. Let's park the transition into calving and we'll maybe circle back onto that.
Yep.
But if we're talking about a transition or any change in feed, and summer and winter crops are good examples, but there could also be a change in feed, an in-shed feeding system at a different time of year. When I, as a nutritionist, think about nutrition, I'm always thinking about the fact that we're feeding two animals. So the first animal or group of animals, and in my opinion, the most important animals, are the rumen microbes. And they are the most important because when we create a healthy rumen environment and the rumen microbes can thrive, they, the bugs, are actually what helps feed our cows. So when we start talking about a transition, I'm thinking about it from a microbiological perspective and how long does it take for the microbes to shift to adapt to a new feed. And when we're feeding a high carbohydrate feed like a turnip or a swede or a grain or a fodder beet, it takes those bugs 21 days to shift and adjust to the new feed. So transition feeding in my mind as a guiding principle would be 3 weeks. Now, I can appreciate that in practice, I talk to farmers all the time and they say, oh, yeah, no, we've got our cows up to their full allocation of crop in 10 days. So,
Ooh.
yes, we as humans have done that. So, yeah, okay. But also remember that the rumen microbes will work at their pace, not our pace. So, the cows will be still adapting. So if we transition those cows onto high carbohydrate feeds in a very quick time frame, best case scenario, the cows are not operating at their optimal efficiency. They're not digesting the feeds that we're giving them as efficiently as they can. Worst case scenario, if we start feeding high carbohydrate feeds like the crops that I mentioned too fast, then we run the risk of creating rumen upset. And worse than that, it is when we can spiral into acidosis.
So, do you want to just give a bit of an explanation to our listeners what acidosis actually is?
Perfect. Okay, no problem. When a cow eats a high carbohydrate feed, such as a swede or a fodder beet or a grain, when that carbohydrate, that starch or that sugar, gets into the rumen, it makes acid or it's quickly broken down into acids called volatile fatty acids. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if there's too much soluble carbohydrate too fast into the rumen, and those volatile fatty acids, which are actually a source of energy for the cow, if they're not absorbed through the rumen wall fast enough, they start to accumulate in the rumen, which drops the pH. Now, we don't want to drop the pH because the microbes, the rumen microbes, want to live in a neutral environment. Just like, I'm not a soil scientist, but just like soil, there's an objective to maintain a certain level of pH in your soil so that the plants can uptake the minerals that we're putting on as fertilizer. Interestingly, the optimal pH range in the rumen is similar to the pH range that you're targeting for your soils because we're creating an environment for those rumen bugs to live happily. If the pH drops too fast, some of our fiber digesting bugs start to die off. And we need those guys because what they're doing is breaking down the fiber that is in our pastures. And that's the source of energy for the cows. So to prevent this from happening in terms of keeping the rumen healthy, we need cows to ruminate. And how we get cows to ruminate is by chewing their cud. So if we know we're feeding a high carbohydrate load feed of any description, we need to make sure that the animals have enough long stem fiber to stimulate cud chewing, because when they're chewing their cud, they're also making saliva. And saliva, when they re-swallow that saliva is a natural buffer, and that helps keep the rumen healthy, keeps the rumen microbes thriving. And when we have healthy, thriving rumen microbes, we can optimize feed conversion efficiency.
And so by long stem fiber, you're meaning like a straw or a hay or pasture silage, something along those lines?
Well, it could even be pasture of a particular quality. So maybe a higher cover will have a higher level of fiber in it. Really short, lush pasture is probably not a great source of that effective fiber. But yeah, it could be straw, it could be hay, it could be silage. It'll be a function of what we've got to hand on farm.
I suppose especially during that winter crop transitioning, you might not necessarily have a lot of pasture available. So that's when
True.
your straw and your hay becomes quite beneficial to cows during that transition period.
Yes, absolutely.
And I guess you're talking about summer and winter crops there, aren't you?
Yes.
So you can have that same issue regardless of you're using a certain summer crop versus a certain winter crop.
I would suggest that the transition to winter crops tend to be more risky than the transition to summer crops because typically in summer crops we still have pasture, as you say, we still have pasture that we're feeding the animals. But slowly, slowly is the mantra.
Yeah.
Carefully, carefully. Watch the cows. Let's listen to our cows. Let's not necessarily go by the calendar. Increase the allocation of the high carbohydrate feed, the crop or the grain, and then keep it at that level for a day. Watch the cows. Are they chewing their cud? If they got good capacity. And then if that's all go, then you can increase the allocation. So I'm always a big one for listening to cows. They'll tell us how they're feeling. And if they're chewing their cud happily, then they're doing good jobs for us.
Would you be moving up in like half a kilo increments, or do you think something bigger than that or something smaller depending on how well they're transitioning?
Well, it probably depends a little bit on what you're transitioning on to. So it's a bit hard for me to give you a specific quantity without understanding the bigger picture. I'd hate to say, oh, yeah, this is how you do it
Mm.
when we're sort of speaking more in general terms. But certainly that's where working with a nutritionist can be really helpful, that you can look at the specifics of what feed you have available, what feed you're transitioning onto, and creating a plan.
Awesome. So if we then move on to that carving transition now,
Mhm.
do you want to give us a little bit more of an explanation around that type of transition and what the importance is here?
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Amelia, for giving me an opportunity to have this conversation. So, theoretically, the transition around calving is the 21 days before calving, which I call a close up dry cow, and the 21 days after calving, which I call the fresh cow. Now, when I first came to New Zealand, people said, oh no, we don't have close up dry cows in New Zealand. We've got springers. And that is true. And even after all these years in being here, I still maintain that we actually do have close up dry cows. And of course, we have springers, but a springer cow is a close up dry cow, but not all close up dry cows are springing yet. And so we talk about that 21-day phase before calving. And that number, again, is not an accident. It comes from the fact that we know that there's a different nutrient requirement for the cow once she starts milking. So in the close up dry cow phase, we want to introduce her to those new feeds that we're feeding. And if we're transitioning into new feeds or different feeds, then it's going to take 21 days for the rumen microbes to adapt. I know we don't always have a perfect world, but ideally, we've got the 21 days to allow the rumen bugs to adjust to the different feeds. Another thing that we want to think about in preparation for calving or the close up dry cow phase is that those cows are making colostrum, and making colostrum is hormonally controlled. And that hormone shift that switches on the colostrogenesis, or the colostrum making, that's 15 days pre-calving. And we know that to make colostrum, the cows need different nutrients. So again, different feeds. So that's what I'd always want to shoot for. Yeah, and then the 21 days after calving, so we've got our colostrums. Everybody knows the cows go into the colostrum mob. But actually, the first 21 days of the lactation is really important as well to meet the nutrient requirements of the cows so they can get up and running and reach their true genetic potential. So theoretically, the transition that I'm talking about around calving is 21 days before calving and 21 days after calving. And if I had to pick a time in the year that is the most important, where I'm going to spend the most of my effort and energy, it will be there.
So we know that the pre-calving and your post-calving requirements are different nutrition-wise. If you look at it, that pre-calving, she's trying to build that milk production, she's trying to still feed that baby inside her, everything like that. Whereas post-calving, she's just trying to focus on continuing that milk production. What requirements around like fiber intake and the mineral side of stuff pre versus post calving? That
Mhm,
makes sense.
mhm. Yeah, I think I'm with you. So that's where it's nice to be able to separate it out and say, well, what are the nutrient requirements of a close-up dry cow compared to a fresh cow? So that close-up dry cow phase is quite I don't need to tell your listeners this is a tricky time. Everybody knows pre-calving is tricky. And I'm going to give you a couple of different examples. So in the close-up dry cow phase, we want to give those cows enough protein because protein makes milk. Protein is the driver for milk production. So we want to give them enough protein so that they can be meeting the needs to, as you say, continue growing that calf for the last 3 weeks. So the calf will grow a lot in those 3 weeks, but also meet the protein requirement for making the colostrum. But we don't want to give her so much protein that she starts leaking milk pre-calving. That can create utter health risk. We also know that if we give her too much protein pre-calving, that can create milk fever risk. So it's about finding that balance of having enough, but not too much. We also know that the more a cow eats pre-calving, the more she'll eat post-calving. It's a pretty easy equation. The more she eats, the more she milks. But if I, for example, want to find that balance between letting cows eat to their full dry matter potential, but restrict or balance the amount of protein that she's getting, I can't just have open slather pasture. We will have milk fevers. So it's about saying, okay, well, how much protein does she need? And how much fiber can I give her to make sure her rumen is well full before she calves? So we balance that, maybe a break of pasture with silage. And then if the milking cows are going to get some concentrate, then again, we want to introduce that concentrate in the pre-calving phase to adjust those rumen bugs. And the other thing we want to think about in that close-up dry cow phase is the balance of minerals, especially macro minerals, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sodium chloride. All of those nutrients can have an influence on the health of the cow around calving. And it's to your question, Amelia, it's a really challenging time because this animal, she's transforming her body from a pregnant dry cow to overnight becoming a lactating cow ready to become pregnant again. So there can be huge changes literally overnight, the day she calves. For example, how much she needs energy pre-calving, and then post-calving, her energy requirements can be double overnight. So it's about how do we manage those things. And so, for example, how do we optimize energy intake? Well, if we're feeding concentrates and we introduce the concentrates to those rumen bugs in the 21 days before she calves, the day she calves and she comes to the shed twice a day to get those concentrates, the rumen's ready for that. And so it's easier to increase the supply of energy for her literally overnight.
So you kind of mentioned a little bit about like that pre-calving to that post-calving to that getting ready to getting calf again. Is there a long-term effect of that if you don't do that pre-calving transition the best you can? Can it then affect from that post-calving all the way through into that mating period?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I love thinking about the egg. So for example, if my cow calves on the 1st of August, then I want to have a successful mating on the 1st of November. And I think it's really fascinating to think that the egg we want to impregnate in November actually starts its development journey back in May.
Wow, that's a lot earlier than what I think a lot of people think it is.
Yeah. And so how that cow is managed, how she's fed, how healthy she is will have an impact on the health of that egg that we want to have successfully mated on the 1st of November. So, when we think about transition, there's a couple of things, couple of layers. So in that time, I'm making a transition onto maybe a winter crop. So yes, it actually does become important to minimize the risk for acidosis because that risk of acidosis could challenge that egg. Then we come into the transition into the calving. And we want to make sure we've got the right balance of nutrients to keep that cow healthy. And we all know that in the early lactation cows, as soon as she's calved, she loses body condition. And that's okay. Negative energy balance. It is what happens when the energy going out in milk production is higher than what the cow can eat. But we can manage those things and make sure that we deliver the optimal amount of nutrients. If we don't, that can have an impact on the viability of that egg. So there is really a strong link between how we manage our cows through that transition, the close-up dry cow, fresh cow phase, and not only peak milk production, but also her reproductive capacity going forward. So it's a really important time.
Yes, it's just important, as you said, to ensure that you monitor your cows all the way through.
Absolutely.
So you're making sure that you are transitioning correct from period to period. And I guess it's the same. Sorry, I'm going to go back a little bit to that crop stuff. I guess it's that saying that it's just as important to transition off as it is to transition on.
Oh, okay. That's a good. So that's yes. And I hear people talk about that a lot, transitioning off of crop. I think about it a little bit differently. And that's
Okay.
okay. Different people look at things differently. I'm always looking forward. So I'm transitioning on to winter crop. And then I'm transitioning the close up dry cow into the lactation.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
You could say that that's transitioning off fodder beet or
Hmm.
off winter crop. But I'm thinking of it, my transition is about looking forward and where am I going and what feeds am I going to feed to the cow in the lactating period. If she's going to get grain in the shed, then I want to introduce that grain. So it's about going forward, not necessarily what's happened behind us has happened behind us. It's about going forward. Now, you made a comment there, Amelia, about monitoring the cows. And yes, I'm a big believer, like I said before, watching cows. Are they chewing their cud? They give us lots of feedback about what's going on for them. And the other really great opportunity we have is also to be monitoring our feed. And I know that New Zealand farmers are very, very good when it comes to feed budgets. I know they're very, very good when it comes to managing pasture yield and volumes. And I also know that my experience has been that a lot of farmers I deal, they just want to be better. Like, just how do I be better? And so being just better, if that's what you're after, it's not necessarily upsetting the whole apple cart. Don't change what you're already doing because there'll be good things about what you're doing. It's how can we take a deeper dive and understand what nutrients we've got our feed budget, but what nutrients do we have? And that becomes a really important thing when we start thinking about meeting the nutrients of these different animals in different stages of the lactation. So, for example, I might have a stack of silage here and I've got a line of baleage there. But what are the nutrients that are in those two different? It might be grass silage and grass silage, but what are the nutrients that are there? And I've had some unfortunate circumstances where I've been called in for major problems when it comes to milk fevers or not a very healthy calving problems. And the good thing is, and I said to the farmer, I said, have you got any feed tests in order to try and find solutions to stopping the metabolic disorder? And the good thing was he had feed tests. And I'm real encouraging people, if there's one thing that people can take away from this podcast is get a feed test on your pasture, on your silages. But this guy had the feed test, which was fantastic. But then I looked at the feed test and said, oh, what about this line of baleage? This looks like it's got the right nutrients to meet the requirements for these cows at this time. And he said, oh, we ate that already. We ate it. We had that. Our dry cows ate that. So it's a good time to be having this conversation now in March to saying, when all of our forages come in for winter feeding, get a feed test on them, and then go through them strategically. How do I be better? I don't have to completely change my feeding system. How do I be better? I can be better by being more strategic. And I'm going to feed this silage to this stock class because that best meets their nutrient requirements.
I think it's actually something that people need to be more aware of on farm these days is if you are producing silage in different forms, even just looking at pasture silage, if you are baling some of it versus putting it into a stack, that they do break down and set differently. So it is important to actually see, as you said, what's actually in that pasture. The dry matter could be very, very different between the two of them. You could have one that's quite wet, one that's a lot drier. And so making sure that you're actually feeding the right amount to each of your cows could be also very different. So doing that actual test on your feeds gives you such a better understanding of what your cows are actually eating. And the same with your maize silage. If you go in and have a look at that maize stack, maybe it hasn't dried out as much as what you wanted, but then you decide to feed it the same as what you normally would, well, it could be very, very different. That the nutrients in that feed could be very different between like a more greener maize silage versus something that's been sitting in the stack for a lot longer.
Yeah, I love that you pick up on that. The dry matter is really important to determine the yield. How much silage do I have? And I would also, again, to your point, really encourage people to be taking that. And people do sometimes get their silages tested for dry matter, so you know how much is there, and get a full nutrient profile. Because I think there's a misconception that there's a link between dry matter and quality, and that doesn't always stack up. Also, different feeds of different quality doesn't mean they're bad or good. It just means that one might be better for one stock class than the other. So yeah, getting nutrient profile of all your silages in your pasture is a huge opportunity. How do we just be incrementally better?
Also, if you do want to do dry matter yourself, you can do it at home in your own microwave.
Yes, but don't use the one in the kitchen because people will be cross with you.
Yeah, make sure you put it in the right container because you can easily set it on fire.
Yeah, and yeah. Been there, done that.
Yes,
Couple
yes, me
times.
too. That microwave did not work well after that. I guess also throwing a little bit of a left field question at you, Andrea,
Mhm.
going back to that like pre-calving transition, is there much of a difference between first calvers requirements versus a mature cow's requirements?
Yeah, good question. I kind of now a first calver is going to be smaller. She should be the same height as her herd mates. We will have grown her so she's nice and tall and she can look at her herd mates eye to eye in a perfect world. But that first calver is, even if she's say the same height as a mixed age cow, she's going to be lighter. So it is true that one of the drivers to determine the nutrient requirements is body weight. So if she's littler, her dry matter intake is going to be smaller than a mixed age cow. Those are the theoretical fundamentals. But when it comes down to practice, again, depending on people's setup and infrastructure, whether you run your first lactation heifer separately from your mixed age cows, that's up to the farm. But I try to, from a practical point of view, the nutrient requirements are similar for both stock classes, whether you're first lactation heifer or mixed age cows.
So I guess it is still important to make sure that they are fed quite similar so that they do transition equally. I guess that does that make
Yes.
sense? So like making sure that they're being fed the same diet at similar levels at least means that they're transitioning through in that same way, and then they should be able to compete better in that post calving as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, processing it in my head is the same thing.
That's good.
So we touched a little bit on health risks, and we talked a little bit about acidosis, and you and I were talking about this prior to this, that people can sometimes get quite confused between the acidosis and ketosis.
Yes.
Do you want to just briefly give us a overview of the differences between them, because one seems to be seen a lot more when it's in crop versus the other.
Yeah. And it's easy to get them mixed up because there is always an interrelationship between health issues. So, just the rough as guts nutritionist description is that acidosis is when we have too much acid in the rumen and rumen upset. And as a result of the upset, it's rumen dysfunction. Ketosis is when there's not enough energy, basically, put simply. So, ketosis is when the cows are so energy deprived, it's causing ill health. Now, it's not surprising to get mixed up with those things because a cow that has acidosis, if she's got a sore tummy, she's not going to eat. And if she doesn't eat, she's not getting the energy she needs. So acidosis sometimes can quickly evolve into ketosis if we don't catch it in time. If we don't get the cow chewing her cud and she's not eating well, then not only does she have a rumen upset, but now she doesn't have enough energy. So she can fall into the ketosis. And all of these things can be interrelated. All of this metabolic disorder cascade that happens if I've got a cow that's calving, for example, has milk fever, she's again not eating very well. And if she's not eating very well, that milk fever can evolve into ketosis as well because she's not eating, she's not getting the energy. There's a strong interrelationship between metabolic disorders. So, again, I'm not a veterinarian, I'm a nutritionist, and I love having these conversations now in March because I'm more interested in building the fence at the top of the cliff. And it takes time to build the fence at the top of the cliff and making sure that we can provide the right nutrients at the right time to prevent health issues as opposed to being at the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff over calving. I don't want to be there. I don't want anyone to be there.
I love that analogy. And one of my lecturers at university, Dr. Kevin Stafford, he used to use it a lot. It's better to build the fence at the top than be the ambulance waiting at the bottom. And I think when you think of that transition feeding and becoming better at what you're doing, I see it as you reinforcing your fence, if that makes sense. So you've started to develop and you've started to implement transition feeding processes. So that's you building that baseline fence and then going further and ensuring that you are looking into the nutrients in the feed that you're doing. To me, that's building that extra barrier on that fence. It's adding more planks, it's strengthening it so that you can avoid anything falling off the edge of that cliff. I think it's an awesome analogy, and I think it's a very easy way for farmers to really think about it in
Mhm.
any aspect. We used to do the same thing when it was actually calving. So, like, not only thinking about that transition into calving, but making sure that the actual calving process went well. And so that's that same thing.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I love your building on the analogy. Farmers have been farming in New Zealand for longer than I've been here. And cows have been calving in New Zealand for longer than what I've been here.
Yeah.
And so it's not about reinventing the wheel. Everybody listening will have a process, either planned or to a lesser or greater degree. Everybody's got how you deal with your Springer cows. But I guess what I like what you're saying is that so there is a fence there, but how robust is the fence? There will be people out there that have never tested a feed in their life, but they've got a system. They're working well and their cows are healthy and everything's tickety boo. But if you do have a challenge and you do have milk fever, example, for greater than 5% of your herd, that's a trigger to say, hey, maybe I need another plank at the top of my fence. And where am I going to look to find which plank I need to buy or create is looking at what materials, what nutrients we have on farm and using them efficiently.
And I think that also goes into, as you said, New Zealanders have been doing this for a very, very long time. But New Zealand is a very vast country when it comes to the actual environment. Northland, you're not going to be feeding a winter crop like fodder beet in Northland, like you might do in Southland or somewhere in the South Island, in Southland, you can't expect to be completely and utterly pasture based 24/7 because all of a sudden it might snow. And,
Yeah, that happens.
you know, we've got farmers this year that got a lot of snow and had to change their feeding regimes and learn how to adjust. And I think it's really important to understand that transition feeding and the way that we balance our nutrient requirements in New Zealand differs from one end of the country to the other. Do you think that that's something that our farmers need to be very aware of?
Okay, this is so beautiful. Thank you, Amelia, because this is are you ready for my soapbox? You ready?
Sure. Yeah, loving it.
This is one of the things that it's a bit of a tricky thing to try to get the concepts across. And I have the great, great good fortune of working with herds right from the top of the north to the bottom of the south. And one of the things that is a really critical message is the nutrient requirements are what they are. So the 500 kilogram cow in Northland and a 500 kilogram cow in Southland, the nutrient requirements for that close-up dry cow phase is the same. As you point out, what we feed them is different. So I always say this too, we feed what we can grow. So if I'm in Northland, I can grow maize silage. And if I'm in Southland, I can't. But the nutrient required, the physiological needs for the cow is the same. So I need to understand what nutrients that I have in the feeds that I can grow to meet those nutrient requirements. This is something that I think a lot about. When I first came to New Zealand, I was rather confused because I had somebody tell me that the only way a cow can make milk is eating pasture. And that was rather confronting to me as a nutritionist, but also made me stop and think, hang on. When I grew up in southwestern Ontario, our cows didn't get any pasture. We had corn, silage, and alfalfa. We didn't have pasture. And it really has caused me to try and stop and think about these things. The nutrient requirement is the nutrient requirement, like I said. The nutrient supply is different. Those cows in southwestern Ontario, they're making milk, eating corn, silage, and alfalfa. Those cows in Northland, they've got maize silage. Cows in Southland, they've got pasture. We feed what we can grow, but the nutrient requirements remain the same.
And I guess it's also, so at that same level, we've got System 1 farmers versus System 5 farmers here in New Zealand. So your one is your pasture based, and they can provide that nutrient at that System 1 level. They just have to look at how they're doing it. Would you say that, or?
That's another thing that I've really enjoyed in working in New Zealand is I have worked with pasture, and pasture farms. No other infrastructure. And remember that it's the nutrients in that pasture that is driving the productivity for the herd. Now, maybe the expectation of production levels will be different in a cow or a System 1 herd because there's only so many nutrients that the cows might be getting from the pasture, as opposed to I'm going to speak in extremes here. There's no one good or bad in this extreme. It's an all pasture-based system versus the highest performing cow in Wisconsin. I think she's doing something like 19 kilograms milk solids every day.
Whew.
Every day, not just the peak. That's what she
Yeah.
does every day. So can that cow in Wisconsin achieve that level of production on all pasture? Well, she's probably going to run out of space in her rumen to fit those nutrients in. So in Wisconsin, they need to give her more concentrates so she gets the nutrients she needs to make that high level. And the all pasture farms in New Zealand, there is an amount of nutrients that the cows are getting from the pasture. And so our level of productivity or production, our expectations are just different. And there's no one right or wrong or good or bad. It's pasture provides this level of nutrients and a TMR provides that level of nutrients. And it's a function. And that's what I love about my job. I can go anywhere in the world, anywhere in New Zealand, and apply these principles of understanding what is the nutrient requirements versus the nutrient supply, and it all makes sense. And that's how everywhere we can find incremental improvement, wherever we are, in whatever system we've got. We use it's nutrients that makes the cow make milk. It's nutrients that drives immune function. And that's what we need to have healthy cows. And one level of production isn't better or worse than the other. It is what it is.
I really liked the way that you said that, because I think there's still this stigmatism in New Zealand with certain farmers, some of these old school guys that think the only way that you can produce good milk is by just feeding pasture. And I like how you said that there's no right or wrong. If someone wants
Mm-mm.
to feed mixed rations, they want to be high input, that's their decision, that's their choice to do that. If you want to be low input or stick to your pasture based system, again, that is your choice, and you are going to breed the type of cow that you feel suits your situation. He's going to breed the type of cows that he feels suits his situation,
Yep.
and we're all going to be producing milk regardless of what that feed is made up of, as long as we're fitting those requirements and then what nutritionally they need.
Yeah, yeah. And my curious nature is to say, well, how is it that the all pasture herds are performing? What is driving that? What are the nutrients they have? Yeah, no right or wrong, no good or bad. I feel very blessed to have had the opportunity in my time in New Zealand to work with all farmers, all systems, all parts of the country. It's kind of fun.
So I just had another question for you that was a little bit left field as well.
Okay. I love left field.
And that is, with the introduction to wearables and boluses and things like that now, how accurate do you think those measurements are along the actual picking up issues with transition or accurate transition data within the rumen? I know that an internal bolus, I would think, would do that slightly more accurately than an external wearable. But I'm just interested to get your opinion on how that's helping farmers or
Mm,
how it's going.
mm, mm. A great question. I love technology. I love that there are different devices. I talked at the beginning about the importance of watching a cow chew or cud. I love that there are devices that can help us do that, particularly in the large herds that we have in New Zealand. It's not necessarily easy. Like at my Nana's house, they had 20 cows. They knew every single cow. They knew her pedigree. They knew her grandma's grandma. They could walk into the barn and see all those 20 cows lying down chewing their cud. And if somebody wasn't chewing their cud, they could pick them up straight away. With our large herds, that's difficult.
Yeah.
That is difficult. So I love the technology. I don't know enough about the technology to say one is better or worse than the other. What little I do know would be that when employing these technologies, it's important to establish a baseline. What is the baseline number of ruminating minutes for your herd? And I don't know that it's so much exactly what the number is. I think that it's when something deviates from the normal is when the alarms can sound. And that baseline or that deviation or people's tolerance from change from the quote unquote norm will be different in different places. And what I would also say is that I'm a huge advocate for animal behavior. And even if you have the technology for the wearables, or if you don't and you're feeling, oh, I should have the technology, no matter what you have, no matter what your infrastructure is, take the time to observe your cows. And they give us amazing feedback, especially again, going back to transition and the importance of rumen function. Go and look out at the cows in the paddock. Not when you're feeding out, just, from time to time, go for a wander and see the cows in the paddock, see what they're telling you.
I found it quite interesting with some of the farmers that I deal with that have employed these technologies, that they love looking at the data you sit there talking to them and they were like, oh, I'll show you this. This is what this cow's doing. And I think a lot of it is then they need to learn how to use that data to then improve their transitions or to then help develop better rumination minutes, or the boluses give you water intake as well. So like how that transition period, including that water intake, makes a huge difference. And I just happened to go and visit a farmer last week that said they had a cow that didn't matter what time of the year it was, didn't matter what you fed her, anything like that. She only ever drank 10 litres a day. That was it, which is...
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah, minimal compared to the other cows, which they were saying were on like, oh, look, she drank 100 litres yesterday and she's already drunken like 57 litres today, and it was only 1 o'clock in the afternoon kind of thing. And so they said they found that because she was drinking so minimally, they said she still produced milk, but she never went above 1 solid for the entire year. And her milk was... there wasn't a lot of it, but it was higher in solids because there wasn't a lot of it. So balancing that transition with making sure that you get that water intake, and how important water intake is for cows as well, to make sure that it's another way for them to balance their microbes in their stomachs and stuff like that as well.
The rumen is a giant fermentation vat. The rumen is like a 200-liter drum wrapped in leather. It's got to have moisture. It's like a swimming pool for those rumen bugs. So water intake is really important. Yeah. So what happened to that cow?
They killed her.
Yeah, I was going to say, she sounds like she'd be on the cull list.
Yeah, she got
She
killed.
wasn't pulling her weight.
No, she wasn't worth keeping, so she went out. But it was the fact that they picked that up just by that data, but also being able to read it and understand how that affects. And as you said, the rumen is this giant fermentation vat. I used to work for Dairy NZ. I worked in the tech team, so did a whole lot of research, and we did research with fistulated cows, so the ones that have got the hole that goes into the rumen. And one of our jobs when we were doing metabolic trials is we had to empty the rumen. So you would take everything out, you get your hands in there, and they loved me doing it because I have really little hands, so I can put both my hands in the cannula. You would empty everything out and weigh it, and weight of it was sometimes 150, 170 kilos of wet weight. And then we always put it back in. We put everything back in, and then you're looking at everything else in there. So like the papillae, the little fingers that are in the rumen, which is, I guess, the surface coverage. Each stomach has a different texture. So the rumen has like little fingers or little papillae. I just like calling them fingers because I think they look like little fingers. And so looking at how that had developed in the cows as well, and how the different feeds affected how it sat and things like that. And we were doing work we did trials with fodder beet, we did trials with plantain and different types of pasture species, chicory, lucerne. So yeah, we looked at everything. I was saying to Andrea earlier, when we did fodder beet trials and we used to get cows that would develop acidosis, bonus of having a fistula is you can put baking soda directly into the rumen. It would help balance the pH level in the rumen a lot faster than if you were treating an acidosis cow that was not fistulated.
I love I call rumen papillae fingers as well. And to build on that, the rumen papillae are the fingers that grab the nutrients. The reason the rumen papillae are there is to increase the surface area of the rumen. Because when the rumen bugs break down the nutrients, it's the volatile fatty acids that the rumen bugs break down are absorbed through those fingers. The fingers catch those nutrients. And that's another thing that we haven't touched on about transition, is that when we start feeding a starch feed, so if you know you're feeding your milking cows some sort of concentrate, then actually when we feed that in the close-up dry cow phase, in the transition phase to that high starch feed, that actually allows the rumen papillae to elongate. And the longer the rumen papillae, the more surface area you have to absorb the nutrients. And you want to maintain the rumen pH so that you've got healthy rumen bugs. And that's how we optimize feed conversion efficiency. Yeah, and what did you say? Your sodium bicarb, that's a buffer, right? That's a buffer.
Yeah.
So you were helping the cow without her having to chew so much cud.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I always loved that metabolic work that we used to do because it was so interesting looking at how the different feeds reacted to the cows. And we measured water intake and things like that in certain feeds, especially at certain times of the year, adjusted their water intake as well. And I think anyone on like a pasture-based system would notice that depending on how much moisture is in their grass is going to affect how
Correct.
much their water intake is. And Northland's in quite a heavy drought at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of the
Mm-hmm.
Waikato are in a bit of a
Mm-hmm.
drought, and so their cows are drinking a lot more because the feed that they're getting is such a higher dry matter. They're needing to take in that moisture to help balance everything out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty easy equation. The more she drinks, the more she eats. The more she eats, the more she milks. And she'll tell us, like, again, these wearables, I think they're so cool. I love them. And remember that observation of animal behavior can also give us insight into whether the cow's drinking or not. Go and watch cows urinate in the paddock. If their urine's clear, they're getting enough water. If their urine is yellow, they're not. I mean, a wearable makes it easier to look at that data across a large herd, but don't feel constrained if you don't have those things. Go ask the cows, they'll tell you.
That's actually something that's quite important. I think farmers have gone away from just looking at their cows, especially in those bigger herds where you employ a lot of staff.
Mm,
It's harder to have that one-on-one interaction with your cows as much, even if it's just driving through the paddock in the middle of the day or something and seeing how many are actually sitting down chewing their cud. Or if you have the luxury where you can look over your farm and you can see all the cows in the paddock and you can see how many of them are sitting down, and at a certain time period you might find that 90% of the herd actually sits down and they're ruminating.
that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and then they're chewing their cud, and that's why it's also important when you're doing that transition onto crop feed, making sure there is still enough room for lying time.
Oh, absolutely.
I could go into so much. So, like, lying time in cows is extremely important for rumination. That's their rumination time, and if you don't have enough space in the paddock for the herd, and what is it, like 4 square meters a cow or something like that, or 2 square
Yeah,
meters?
I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
lying time is also incredibly important for hoof health.
Mm.
The cows need to take a load off and they need to lie down. They can chew their cud standing up too, and they will. But I absolutely agree with you is that cow needs time to lie down.
And there's been a lot of research on that over the last few years coming out of Dairy NZ and a lot of the vet clinics and stuff, just looking at that importance of that space and that lying time.
Yes.
And, cows don't really want to lie in complete and utter mud. We try to
Mm,
avoid that when we can, and just ensuring that there is enough space for them. And I think that helps that transition work a lot more as well, because if they're not having that rumination time, and you can correct me if I'm completely wrong here, Andrea, if they're not having that rumination time, are they adapting and transitioning onto that feed properly and
mm.
in a timely manner, or is it going to slow down that transition?
Oh, definitely. That's always the first thing that I look at when I walk out into a mob of cows is are they ruminating? And like you say, the area, and I'm sorry, I don't have those figures off the top of my
No, I
head.
can't think of them either. So,
If we think about that transition into calving phase, and I see more and more calving pads around. So again, making sure that they've got the nutrients that they need, but also if they're on a calving pad, do they have enough space for each individual to A, get to the feed bunk and eat what they need to eat? And also, as you say, to be able to lie down. Cow comfort is an important feature of improved productivity. I said that one day, I was talking about cow comfort and the importance of cow comfort. And I had a guy challenge me on it. It's like, what do you want me to give him a bunch of couches or something? I don't even have comfort in my own house. And I'm like, yeah, but, and so he was sort of downplaying these things. But cow comfort, good nutrition, good management leads to optimal performance. Optimal performance leads to economic viability. Optimal performance leads to environmental sustainability. So actually, yes, Cow comfort, even for somebody who's super focused on the numbers and the bank manager type, cow comfort is the foundation behind healthy, happy, productive cows.
And I think in New Zealand, it's pretty easy to meet that requirement if you can ensure that your stocking rates are suitable so that you're not putting too many cows in one paddock. And that if you have the luxury of a barn system when it gets really cold or when it gets really hot, amazing for cows. Heat stress is almost worse than cold stress.
True.
I'm not even going to try. I think it's like 13 degrees is like a cow's optimum temperature, outside temperature that they want to work in. So having the ability for them to get under shade is really important. But it's not hard for farmers in New Zealand to kind of fit these requirements to then get the best results out of their cows. It just does take time to think about it. But yeah, we're really digressing
Absolutely.
off
We
transition
have,
completely.
but it all links in. It absolutely all links in.
Yeah. And happy cows are going to be cows that are going to transition better and they're going to produce better and they're going to ruminate and they're going to do all these things because they're happy.
Yeah.
It's important to have happy cows, which I like seeing happy cows. I love seeing cows wandering around the paddocks and sitting down and chewing their cud. And yeah, it's a great sight when you drive down the road.
It is a great sight. I was at a farm there a couple of weeks ago and I pulled up the laneway and I was absolutely delighted. There were a mob of, I don't know, there might have been a 900 cows in the mob, and I could count how many of them were standing up.
Oh, wow.
There were like maybe 10 cows, and it was just such a picture, sort of the middle of the afternoon, and they were all lying down, chewing their cud, performing.
Great to see. I feel like we could keep talking about this for hours.
I think so too. Well, I've been doing it for a lifetime and I plan to continue doing it, but I appreciate that the podcast format is finite.
And I think this is a great way for us to really target and give farmers some better tools into how to improve that fence that they're building.
Yeah. As I say, if there's one takeaway that I can offer everybody, we talked about a lot of stuff, but if there's one takeaway I can offer is get your forages tested.
Yeah, very important, as you've said, to ensure that you're feeding the right nutrients at the right time to those different herds.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So we will wrap it up there. Andrea, you have been amazing. Your knowledge around nutrition and cows, as I said, you could go on for ages. I could ask you more and more questions and would be quite happy sitting here learning from you. I've had such a joy talking to you today, and I'm hoping that we can do it in the future and talk about different types of nutrition with our cows because we always want to improve and be better. So thank you.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity and allowing me the bandwidth to be able to get on my soapbox and talk about the difference between nutrient supply and nutrient demand. I really appreciate every opportunity I have to help educate and empower people.
If you have any questions about today's topic or any other topics you would like us to talk about, you can get in contact with us through our website, Facebook, or Instagram, which are all linked in our show notes. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Andrea, again for your amazing knowledge. And I will be back next month with a new guest and a new topic. Until then, happy farming. Bye.